Okay, let's do an overview of macro controls. So, what are macro controls? Massive provides 8 assignable knobs to one or several of the other parameters within Massive, as well as 4 macro controls that involve the MIDI keyboard, and we'll talk about those in a second. So you have all these different parameters within the software, right? You have faders, you have knobs, you got lots going on. Well, the macro controls allow you to control one or more of those parameters using one single knob. For example, in this patch, let's move down to macro control number 1, and it's called table. So I can figure out where macro control 1 is assigned by locating the number 1 within the modulation target slots. So here's a number 1, here's a number 1. I think that's looks like it for now. Yes. So this is called table, and the designer called it table because this macro control controls these wavetable position knobs on both of the both oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. So you can see here that we have this yellow ring on the outside of this wavetable position knob. That is the range of this macro control knob down here. So the designer set up this range to start here about 1030 and go all the way to the top. And on the first oscillator over here, this range goes across the entire course of this knob's wavetable position. So that means I can use this one macro control to change both of these parameters with one knob. That's really useful, both for using automation and for assigning to your MIDI keyboard, which we'll talk about in a second. Similarly, this cutoff macro control, number 3, this knob is located in these modulation targets, the cutoff frequency of filter 2 and the cutoff frequency of filter 1. You can see the number 3 there, and we have a range for those as well. That means I can change the cutoff frequency of both filters using one knob. And then just to reinforce this point, the reso or resonance is macro control number 4, and that's here in the resonance of the 2 filters. So you can see how you can use one knob to assign it to many different parameters, and that way you can control multiple parameters at once. That's really useful. Also, when you're building a patch, and maybe you have an effect that you like, but you don't want it in there all the time necessarily, it's best to assign that to a macro control. And that way you can, you can try out the sound with it, try it out without it. So you don't have to just use the macro controls to control many parameters. You can also assign them to some parameters that you maybe want to not have all the time. And you'll see how that works later on when we are designing our own patches. So you have 8 options there. All of these are right-clickable, and you can see what it is controlling and where it is assigned to the MIDI keyboard, and you can also assign it yourself by choosing MIDI Learn, or you can also swap with the other macro controls. And that's a useful, quick way to change what's going on with your parameters. In the macro control section, you also have 4 other more advanced macro controls that are associated with MIDI keyboard information. So you can see this MIDI keyboard image down here, this icon. And so what are these for? Well, the first one is key tracking. The second is velocity. The third is aftertouch. And the fourth is trigger random. And we'll walk through each of these one at a time. So the key tracking macro control means that when you assign it to a parameter, the Massive will understand the pitch of the note that you are sending through the MIDI information, and it will have that parameter respond according to that pitch. This is really useful, for example, on the cutoff frequency of a filter. You can have it key tracked, and therefore low notes won't be too dull and high notes won't be too bright, because that cutoff frequency is tracking the key of the MIDI note that you are sending it. Next, you have velocity. It's similar, but this means that Massive can understand the velocity, or literally just how hard you're striking a key on your MIDI keyboard. So you can see that velocity is assigned to the cutoff frequency here and here. That means that if I lightly strike the key, the cutoff knob parameter will respond in a certain way. If I strike a key harder, the cutoff frequency knob will respond differently. So that's really cool. That gives you a lot of natural emotion to these patches, so that when you're playing it live or even programming it in, you can have it adjust to the velocity of how you strike the key. Aftertouch, some MIDI keyboards have this, not all, but some do. Aftertouch is when you strike a key and then you're holding it down. The aftertouch is the sensitivity to how much weight you put on that key after it's been struck. A good application for this is, for example, vibrato. So if you assign this aftertouch macro control to your vibrato depth like this, then I can push a key and then push down a little bit harder, and that vibrato will swell in, which is pretty cool. And then the last one is random trigger. This you can assign to different parameters, and it will simply create a random response to any note that is pushed. So that gives you sort of a cool, crazy kind of feel with some of these different parameters, and you can make this extreme or subtle, and it will either humanize your patch a little bit, or you can have it respond in sort of crazy, extreme ways. So that's the random trigger, or TRR, trigger random. So that's it for the macro controls. They will make a lot more sense later when we actually start building our own patches. You'll see how they work. And so just something to keep in mind as we move forward. See you in the next lecture.